It was supposed to be a civil discussion. The stage lights in the Washington, D.C. studio buzzed faintly overhead. The flags of the United States and the African Union hung behind the panel of guests. The moderator's tone was calm, the audience respectful. CNN's primetime special, Global Partnerships in the 21st Century, had brought together Vice President Kamala Harris and Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, for what was billed as a historic dialogue. But no one was prepared for what would happen next. Traoré sat poised in his navy blue suit, posture upright, eyes focused. His English was clear, though marked with the French-inflected accent of West Africa. He had been responding to a question about U.S. military involvement in the Sahel when Kamala Harris chuckled. It wasn't just any chuckle. It was sharp. Public. Dismissive. "Excuse me," she said, trying to hide the smile, "it's just, the way you say, strategic sovereignty, I mean, it's a little rich coming from someone whose country depends on our satellites to track their own borders." There was a moment of stunned silence. Traoré blinked, not out of confusion, but restraint. The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Some in the audience let out awkward laughs, not sure how to react. Harris, realizing the tension, quickly pivoted back to policy talk, but the damage was done. The cameras were still rolling. What millions watching saw wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was an American vice president mocking the accent, and, by implication, the intelligence, of an African leader, live on television. Traoré didn't interrupt. He didn't lash out. He calmly waited his turn. Then, in measured tones, he said, "Madam Vice President, I was not aware that pronunciation disqualified people from having principles. If you prefer, I can speak in French, or in silence. But my people will still hear me." The studio froze. The moderator stammered, trying to transition to another topic. Harris didn't respond. And social media exploded. Within minutes, #RespectTraoré and #KamalaMockery were trending. Influencers, political commentators, and ordinary viewers were weighing in. Some called it a cultural misunderstanding. Others called it exactly what it was, humiliation. On purpose. But Traoré wasn't finished. That night, as the clip went viral, his legal team, led by renowned international attorney Malik Diop, issued a statement. A defamation lawsuit would be filed against Vice President Harris in a U.S. civil court. Not for political points. For $100 million. For the dignity of a nation, and the voice of every accent the world tried to silence, the statement read. Kamala Harris had laughed. But no one was laughing now. By morning, the legal notice had been delivered to the Vice President's office. Typed in clean black lettering across ivory white paper, the lawsuit accused Kamala Harris of public defamation, ethnic mockery, and the intentional humiliation of a foreign head of state. The amount, $100 million. But the symbolism weighed even more. Cable networks were in a frenzy. Did Traoré really just sue the sitting Vice President of the United States? Asked one MSNBC anchor. He's going to lose, scoffed a Fox News panelist. It's a PR stunt. But those closest to Traoré knew otherwise. This wasn't about cameras or headlines. It was personal, and calculated. Inside the Burkina Faso embassy in Washington, Ibrahim Traoré sat with his legal team, documents spread across the conference table. He hadn't slept. His jaw was tight, his voice clipped but calm. "This is not about me," he told Malik Diop, flipping through media statements. "It's about the message she sent to every African watching: you're not articulate. You're not serious. You're not welcome. That ends today." Across the city, Kamala Harris was already on damage control. Her staff scrambled to clarify the clip, claiming she had been reacting to a policy contradiction, not to Traoré's accent. But the internet wasn't buying it. Clips were circulating side by side, Harris's laughter, her tone, the face she made, all slowed down and magnified. Even longtime allies were uneasy. "This isn't the look we want right now," muttered one Democratic strategist on MSNBC. "Especially with the Global South watching." But Traoré wasn't done shaking the system. He held a press conference in D.C. that afternoon. Wearing a dark tan suit and speaking in the same accent that had been mocked the night before, he faced a row of flashing cameras. "Let me be clear," he said slowly. "This lawsuit is not vengeance. It is a statement. A line. That those who claim to champion diversity must live by it, not laugh at it." Reporters shouted questions. "President Traoré, what outcome do you want? Do you expect the White House to respond?" He answered with clarity. "I want a public apology. I want a precedent. And I want every child who has ever been mocked for how they speak to know that silence is not their only option." Meanwhile, inside the White House, the situation was escalating. President Biden had been briefed. Privately, he was furious. "We can't afford this," he muttered to advisors. "We need Africa now more than ever." And she just gave them every reason to turn away. Harris remained silent, publicly. But behind closed doors, she called Traoré's move an overreaction and vowed not to apologize. "It'll blow over," she told aides. But it wasn't blowing over. Because for once, someone had called the bluff, and the world was watching. Inside a sleek CNN studio in Atlanta, a panel of political analysts debated the unprecedented turn of events. The Chiron read, "Traoré sues Harris, global fallout looms." "He's just making noise," said one pundit dismissively. "There's no way this goes to court." But another guest shook her head. "You don't get it. This isn't just about law. It's about dignity. He's not just suing a person, he's suing a system." That sentiment was resonating far beyond America's borders. In Nairobi, Accra, Johannesburg, and Dakar, major networks were airing Traoré's press conference on repeat. The clip of him saying, "This lawsuit is not vengeance. It is a statement," had gone viral, translated into dozens of languages. In Burkina Faso, rallies broke out in support of their president. Students chanted in the streets. Farmers marched with signs reading, "Our accent. Our power." Traoré, however, stayed composed. In a private conversation with his communications director, he spoke with measured calm. "I don't want chaos. I want clarity. Let the world see what happens when someone draws a line in the sand, and refuses to step back." But Kamala Harris was preparing a countermove. That evening, she broke her silence with a carefully scripted interview on 60 Minutes. "I never intended to mock President Traoré," she said, her voice soft. "I was responding to a policy contradiction, not his manner of speech." When asked whether she would issue an apology, she hesitated. "I believe in dialogue. But I will not be bullied." Traoré watched the segment from his hotel suite in D.C., arms crossed, eyes unmoving. "She thinks this is politics," he said quietly. "But this is culture. This is centuries of being dismissed packed into one smirk." That same night, he sent an open letter to the American people. It was published in the New York Times under the headline, "Why I Am Suing the Vice President." In it, he wrote, "I come not as an enemy of America, but as a friend tired of being laughed at. If we are truly to move forward, together, then we must build a new language. One that has no room for ridicule and no tolerance for superiority masked as humor." The letter sparked a storm. Some praised him. Others attacked him. But no one could ignore him. By the following morning, the hashtag #IStandWithTraoré was trending worldwide. Celebrities, authors, and even U.S. senators had begun to weigh in. This was no longer a diplomatic disagreement. It was a cultural reckoning, and the room Kamala Harris once thought Traoré didn't belong in, was now his stage. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was swarmed with cameras, journalists, and demonstrators. Banners waved in the hot July wind. Some read, "Free Speech Matters." Others simply said, "Respect Africa." Inside, the mood was tense. It was the preliminary hearing for Traoré versus Harris, and the room was packed. U.S. Marshals stood along the walls, while legal observers from around the world had flown in to witness what many were calling the most symbolically loaded case of the decade. Ibrahim Traoré entered the courtroom in a dark navy suit, no tie, just a crisp white shirt. His posture was upright. His eyes, unwavering. Kamala Harris arrived minutes later, surrounded by legal counsel and staffers. She avoided eye contact. Traoré's lead counsel, an African-American civil rights attorney named DeAndre Hall, rose first. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not just a defamation case. This is a question of dignity. When a sitting vice president mocks the accent of a foreign leader on live television, she doesn't just insult one man, she sends a signal to every child, every immigrant, every person whose voice carries the weight of a different world." Gasps echoed. Reporters typed furiously. Harris's lawyer stood next. "Your Honor, we will argue that the vice president's remarks were political in nature and protected by free speech. But let me be clear, the plaintiff is manufacturing offense where none was intended." Traoré's gaze never left the bench. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't moved. The judge called for a recess. Outside, media coverage exploded. Pundits framed the case as everything from a free speech fight to a clash of civilizations. But something else was brewing, quietly. That evening, in an off-the-record meeting with State Department officials, an advisor warned Harris privately, "He's not just winning legal ground. He's winning the narrative." Indeed, universities began scheduling debates. Bookstores curated reading lists on colonial language bias. A famous actor posted, "Accent isn't a flaw. It's history pronounced differently." Inside the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, ministers discussed issuing a formal statement of solidarity. One said, "If this happened to Traoré, it could happen to any of us." But amid the swirling media chaos, Kamala Harris retreated. She canceled appearances. Delayed speeches. Her staff argued internally, should she double down, or offer a private apology to neutralize the storm? Meanwhile, in a quiet chapel in D.C., Ibrahim Traoré lit a candle. "Not for revenge," he said aloud to no one. "For remembrance. Of every time we were told we sounded wrong. That ends here." And as court resumed the next day, one thing became clear. This would be more than a legal battle. It would be a moral referendum. The second day of hearings began with a ripple of tension. Every seat was taken. The courtroom was silent, the type of silence that hangs before either a storm or a reckoning. Kamala Harris had arrived early. Her posture was different now, less assertive, more restrained. She whispered to her legal team, occasionally glancing toward Traoré, who sat unmoved, as if carved from resolve. The judge entered, and the room rose. Everyone expected another round of legal arguments, but what came next was unexpected. Harris's team requested permission for her to address the court directly. "All rise," the bailiff repeated, slightly unsure, as the vice president stepped forward. "Your Honor," Harris said, "I ask to speak not as a defendant, but as a citizen of this nation and a participant in global leadership." Traoré's eyes narrowed. "I regret," she said slowly, "that my words on that program were taken to cause offense." She paused. "But I must also say, intent matters. I never meant to belittle President Traoré. My remarks were off the cuff. Misinterpreted. The accusations made here today do not reflect who I am." She turned slightly toward Traoré. "If President Traoré felt hurt, that was not my intention. I hope this case can move forward with clarity, not emotion." She sat. The silence in the courtroom wasn't respectful. It was hollow. Traoré rose. He didn't ask the judge. He didn't raise his hand. He simply stood. The courtroom froze. "Permission to respond, Your Honor," he said. The judge, stunned, gave a single nod. Traoré took 2 steps forward. His voice was calm, but his words cut like truth through fog. "I do not ask for apologies shaped in legal language and softened by advisors," he began. "I do not ask that you claim it wasn't your intention, because the road to disrespect is paved with such excuses." He looked directly at Kamala Harris. "You mocked something sacred to millions, not just me. You mocked the sound of a land that raised its voice through centuries of chains. You mocked the way we speak truth, not with perfection, but with pain." Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. "I am not here for vengeance. I am here to draw a line between what power allows, and what dignity demands." The room broke into applause, though the judge called for order. Outside the courtroom, the internet exploded. Clips of Traoré's speech went viral within minutes. The hashtag dignity has an accent trended worldwide. Prominent American activists, African diplomats, even linguists, praised the moment as the most powerful moral stand taken in an American court in decades. Kamala Harris left the building quickly, surrounded by aides. One reporter caught her on the way out. "Do you regret mocking his accent now, Madam Vice President?" She didn't answer. But the silence spoke volumes. That night, inside the White House, Kamala Harris sat in the Roosevelt Room with her most trusted advisors. The tension in the room was thick enough to chew through. Legal analysts were whispering behind closed doors. Polling numbers were already dropping in battleground states. Minority leaders had started distancing themselves. She knew what was happening, and she knew who had done it to her. Across town, in a modest guest residence secured by the Burkina Faso embassy, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't celebrating. He was reviewing a document his legal team had just finalized, a motion to proceed with formal discovery. Emails, transcripts, even rehearsal footage from Harris's team would now be subject to subpoena. This wasn't just a civil suit anymore. This was a battle of reputations. Back at the White House, a communications aide finally broke the silence. "Madam Vice President, respectfully, it's not just about the courtroom anymore. It's the narrative." Kamala turned sharply. "You think I don't know that? We're being painted as imperial bullies. And he's speaking for more than just himself now." Kamala exhaled, slowly. "He's dangerous." "No," one of her senior legal strategists said. "He's brilliant." Across social media, clips of Traoré's courtroom speech had now been translated into 15 languages. African youth, civil rights activists in Chicago, students at UCLA, even political satirists in Brazil, they were all sharing one phrase: dignity has an accent. And everywhere, Kamala Harris's moment of mockery was being replayed in slow motion. The lawsuit had done more than demand money. It had exposed something deeper, a fault line in how the world viewed power, speech, and respect. In Burkina Faso, state TV aired the full court exchange. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou, waving banners not with slogans of revenge, but with messages of pride. "We are not the echo of the West," one sign read. "We are the voice of tomorrow." Traoré saw the footage and said nothing. He was preparing for what came next. Because the next phase wasn't just about the past, it was about forcing the world to decide whether ridicule of culture, however veiled, would still be tolerated in the halls of global leadership. Kamala Harris stared at her reflection in the window of the Roosevelt Room. "He's cornered me," she whispered. "No," her aide replied carefully. "He's invited you. The question is whether you'll stand up, or stay seated." 3 days after the lawsuit went public, Kamala Harris agreed to sit down for an exclusive interview with CNN. The pressure was immense. Advisors had begged her to cancel. "You'll only make it worse," one warned. But Harris was determined to take back control of the narrative. Across the Atlantic, Traoré was informed of the interview's timing. He said nothing, but quietly called his legal team and told them to watch every second, not for political points, but for evidence. The set was sleek. Lights dimmed. Anderson Cooper faced the vice president with his usual piercing gaze. "Madam Vice President," he began, "let's not dance around it. Did you mock President Ibrahim Traoré's accent?" Kamala straightened. "I used humor. It was in poor taste. But let me be clear, I never intended to belittle anyone's heritage." Cooper didn't flinch. "He says it was more than that. He says it was the voice of a continent you mocked." Harris hesitated. I think I underestimated the emotional impact. That's on me." That clip, just those 3 seconds, went viral by morning. That's on me. But it wasn't enough. What followed next would stun her team. "Ibrahim Traoré," she said, leaning slightly forward, "is a gifted communicator. And whether or not I agree with his views, I now realize, mocking how someone sounds isn't just poor politics. It's poor humanity." The admission landed hard. Her words ricocheted across social platforms. Some applauded her humility. Others called it damage control. In Ouagadougou, Traoré watched the clip in silence. When his chief counsel asked him what he thought, he answered, "She didn't apologize. She positioned." "But the world heard something," his advisor said. "Maybe that's enough." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the rising sun. "Sometimes," he said finally, "even a late echo can reach the right ears." Meanwhile, Kamala's office was flooded with statements from African American advocacy groups, African diplomats, and even her own donors. "She needs to sit with him," one influential backer said. Publicly. Now. The lawsuit was still active. The court date still stood. But a new narrative was unfolding. Not a courtroom showdown. A public reckoning. 2 days after Kamala Harris's interview aired, something unexpected arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou, an official letter embossed with the seal of Burkina Faso's presidency. Inside was a simple but striking message. To the Office of the Vice President of the United States. You are cordially invited to a public roundtable on international diplomacy, respect, and cross-cultural dialogue. The event will be hosted at the Ouagadougou Civic Hall, broadcast live across multiple global platforms. President Ibrahim Traoré believes that conversation is sometimes more powerful than courts. Sincerely. Office of the President. Kamala Harris's team went into chaos. "Is this a trap?" one aide asked. "What if it's a PR ambush?" another worried. But Kamala stood still, reading the letter again. "He's calling me out," she said. "But he's also calling me up. And I'm not hiding from this." The White House wasn't thrilled. "This lawsuit is ongoing. You can't be seen negotiating in the middle of it." But Harris ignored the pushback. She flew to Burkina Faso 3 days later, under full security and even fuller scrutiny. As the plane touched down, a swarm of cameras waited. She stepped onto the tarmac to applause, protest, and curiosity, all at once. At the Civic Hall, the stage was simple. 2 chairs. No podiums. No handlers. Just a live audience, journalists, and one moderator from the BBC. Then Ibrahim Traoré entered the room. The applause was deafening. But his face remained calm, not triumphant, not vengeful. Kamala stood as he approached, unsure whether to extend her hand. But Traoré did it first. They shook. The moderator cleared his throat. "Welcome, Vice President Harris. Welcome, President Traoré. Before we begin, what compelled you both to be here? Kamala answered first. I believe leadership requires listening, even when it's uncomfortable. And I came to listen. Then all eyes turned to Traoré. He smiled lightly, then spoke slowly. I came, he said, because I believe when the world watches how we disagree, we show them how we truly lead. A quiet settled over the room. No shouting. No insults. Just two leaders, seated across from one another, separated by cultures, positions, and wounds, but united by one burning question. Can dignity be restored without vengeance? The cameras rolled. The conversation had begun. The civic hall in Ouagadougou felt less like a debate stage and more like a tribunal of global dignity. The moderator leaned in. Mr. President, let's begin plainly. Do you still plan to pursue the lawsuit against Vice President Harris? Traoré didn't blink. The legal action is not about revenge. It is about recognition. When a person in a position of global power uses mockery to diminish another's culture, it is not personal, it is political. And political disrespect requires a political response. Kamala shifted in her seat. But, Traoré added, I am also a man of dialogue. That's why we are here. The moderator turned to Kamala. Vice President, how do you respond? Kamala took a breath. I underestimated the impact of my words. I admit that. What I meant as humor was heard as humiliation. And for that, I apologize. A murmur swept through the audience. But Traoré remained stone still. Do you apologize for what you said, or for how it was received? Kamala's eyes narrowed. For both. That was the first real moment of tension. Not a clash of tempers, but a clash of truths. Traoré leaned forward. Then let me ask this, what did my accent tell you? That I was less American? Less intelligent? Or simply not part of your room? Kamala hesitated. No, she said. It told me that I still carry bias. That I hear the world through one lens too often. And that's not your burden to carry, it's mine. The moderator turned to the crowd. Let's open it up. Questions from the floor. A young Burkinabe woman stood. Vice President Harris, how can you represent global leadership if your instinct is to mock the voices of others? Kamala answered without flinching. Because real leadership is not about being flawless, it's about being willing to evolve. This is part of that evolution. Then a man from the back rose. President Traoré, what would make you withdraw your lawsuit? The room turned silent. Traoré didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Kamala with piercing stillness. When respect becomes policy, he finally said. When the apology is matched with action, not for me, but for the many who never get to speak in rooms like this. It was no longer a legal battle. It was a moment of global reckoning, about power, perception, and what it takes to be heard. The moderator signaled the final segment was approaching. Two leaders sat across from one another. And now, the world waited to see not just who would win, but who would rise. The final moments of the televised debate weren't scripted. They weren't polished. But they were unforgettable. President Ibrahim Traoré and Vice President Kamala Harris sat in silence as the moderator turned to the audience one last time. What should this moment mean, he asked. To both Africa and America? Traoré stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It should mean, he said slowly, that dignity has no accent. That leadership isn't measured in native fluency or Ivy League degrees, it's measured by the courage to stand up when dismissed, and to keep standing when mocked. His gaze swept across the room. I have nothing against America, he continued. I simply have something for my people. For their right to be respected not as beneficiaries of foreign policy, but as equals in global dialogue. He paused. Kamala Harris is not my enemy. But she reminded me, perhaps without meaning to, that the world still has rooms where certain voices are laughed at before they're heard. That must end. And tonight, it begins to. Then Kamala stood too. And to the surprise of many, she turned directly to Traoré and offered her hand. "You taught me something," she said. "Not about Burkina Faso. Not even about Africa. But about humility. And what it looks like when a man carries his people's dignity on his back, and doesn't let it drop, even when ridiculed." The two shook hands. It wasn't a photo op. It was a peace between two worlds that rarely meet on equal terms. The crowd rose in standing ovation, not for a winner, but for the truth that had emerged. Later that night, across news channels from CNN to Al Jazeera, the closing image was the same: Traoré and Harris side by side, not smiling for the camera, but holding the weight of 1,000 silenced voices finally being heard. And as the Burkinabe president stepped off the stage, a journalist shouted, "Will you still pursue the lawsuit?" Traoré turned slightly and replied with a calm smile. The real victory was never in the courtroom. It was in the room itself. And just like that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind not just headlines, but history. Tonight was never about revenge. It was about reminding the world that dignity has a sound, and it doesn't have to come in perfect English. It can come with an accent, with a different rhythm, with unfamiliar tones. But it's still valid. Still powerful. Still human. I didn't sue because I was offended. I sued because silence, in the face of mockery, is complicity. And I refuse to be complicit in the normalization of disrespect, not just toward me, but toward any leader who dares to rise from beyond the usual centers of power. You can question my policies. You can debate my ideas. But you will not reduce me to how I speak. This lawsuit was never about money. It was about memory. So that the next young African, Asian, or South American leader, who walks into a Western room full of smirks and subtle laughs, will know someone once stood here and didn't shrink. And that made all the difference.